Let's take you now to the World Economic Forum, which says while vaccine manufacturing is lagging in Africa, demand is set to more than double in volume over the next decade, from 1 billion doses today to over 2.7 billion in 2040. Our business reporter, Ntokozo Khumalo, is at the African Continental Free Trade Area Business Forum in Cape Town and is standing by for more. Ntokozo, very good morning to you. How do African pharmaceutical companies up their market share, and what role could BRICS play there as you make your observations?
Good morning. Well, the pharmaceutical sector was one of the key priority sectors over the last 3 days at the business forum, and delegates in the industry saying that the lack of industrialization in the sector actually offers a double whammy risk, which is lost economic activity, but also the losing lives and livelihoods. And just to help us explore a little bit how the sector could gain a little bit more of the African market share, I am now joined by Stavros Nicolaou, who is the Executive Director of Strategic Trade at Aspen. Thank you so much for talking to us. Now, you were part of sessions that were focusing and zoning in on the pharmaceutical industry. Talk to us about what are those bottlenecks that really the industry is facing to struggle to pick up its market share, specifically in Africa with so much demand.
Firstly, let me thank you for having me on, and let me also positively reflect on this conference. We're almost at the end of day 3, and I think there's been a diverse audience representing multiple sectors with one objective only, and that objective is how do we aggregate the volumes of Africa to give Africa global competitiveness. So without aggregating our volumes, if you look at 54 fragmented, desegregated countries, you're never going to get economies of scale. And that really goes to the heart of the question you've asked me. So pharma is a very important sector for the continent because we have the most disproportionate disease burden of any continent in the world. And yet we import 99% of our vaccines. We only produce 1% locally, and we import around 80% of our pharmaceutical requirements. It doesn't make sense if you have the most disproportionate disease burden. So what do we do, and what is the pharmaceutical industry calling for and collaborating with the African Continental Free Trade Area on? It's 2 things. The first is that we need a pooled procurement mechanism. So in other words, if the continent doesn't aggregate all its volumes, as I was saying earlier, and you have volume and economies of scale that make sense for the continent to produce, then you unfortunately are not going to have sustainable facilities. So that's the first problem, is we need to aggregate all our volumes. The second thing is we need to set up capacity to do procurement on the continent. So it's all well and good putting up facilities, as I said earlier, but unless there's a coordinated, cohesive procurement approach, both at a country level but continentally wide, unless you do that, then you are going to be putting up white elephants on the continent. And we don't need it. We must be known for African elephants, not white elephants, right? So those are the 2 most immediate things that need to be addressed. There's a couple of other constraints and challenges that we've been discussing. But I'm afraid unless you've got sustainable demand on the continent, and unless the governments and the African Union, the international procurement agencies, unless they are contractually committed to buying from African producers, we will not sustain these facilities.
Now, Aspen obviously is a global player. How do geopolitics actually play then into it? Because you are both in Russia and Ukraine. How does that affect, just the pharma industry and trickling down to the continent?
Firstly, let me say that Aspen is a global business, as you say, and we're a global business that is proudly African. We have some of our most important manufacturing facilities on the African continent. Our facility in Port Elizabeth, Kibega, is our flagship facility. It produces products for the world. So we are a South African business that supplies very important products to the rest of the world. We don't discriminate against whose life you should save and whose life you shouldn't. And many of our medicines are life-saving, critical medicines. And whether a patient is in the Ukraine, in Russia, or anybody else, okay, if a patient needs something to survive and you're going to save a person's life, that's what our business is about, and that's what any healthcare business should be about. Very different to the humanitarian approach that one takes. And of course we've been the company in Africa as Aspen that has been the most active in providing humanitarian support and relief to Ukraine. We did this in a number of forms. Firstly, we helped evacuate the South African medical students that were stranded in Ukraine and couldn't find their way back home. They were stranded on the borders of Ukraine near Hungary. So we helped evacuate and bring back safely those students to South Africa, and many of them have been able to continue with their medical studies. Secondly, we've supplied around 200,000 doses of critical care medicines. So these are medicines that we donated that are required to perform surgeries for Ukrainian patients that have had limbs blown off and amputees, etc., etc. And then more recently, we've done several of those incidentally, but more recently we were able to donate life-saving cancer medicines, oncology drugs, to children who could not access these in Ukrainian cancer centers. So it's one thing looking at geopolitics, but there's a humanitarian issue. And Aspen is very strong on providing humanitarian relief where and where we can, and in those jurisdictions that we operate in. We've done a very similar thing in Lebanon when there was the explosion in Lebanon, the earthquake in Turkey, the earthquake in Syria. So humanitarian relief and where we can support and assist is one of our priorities.
Dr. Nicolau, thank you for talking to us. Of course, that was Stavros Nicolau, who is Aspen Pharmacy's Executive Director of Strategic Trade, just talking to us about how we can work on industrializing the pharma industry in Africa. And we are still going to have a little bit more sessions today. It is the last day of the Business Forum.